Today's lecture will be on Chapter 14, Politics and Prosperity, Section 1, A Republican Decade. Today we're going to take a look at what are the events that fueled the Red Scare of the early 1920s. We want to look at the conflicts that led to the major labor strikes of 1919. And then we're going to look at Republican presidential leadership of the Harding and Coolidge administrations. Okay, so start us off here. We want to make sure that we look at sort of what was happening at the post-World War I world. The 1920 election is one that's quite different. As we know, President Harding is going to win, or candidate Harding is going to become president after the 1920 election. For a number of reasons, and a lot of them just dealing with the turmoil of the last couple of years. We're emerging from the shadow of World War I and all the trouble that was like. We're trying to shift an economy away from military production to civilian production, and the economy is really in rough shape. So, for example, there's just not a lot of jobs as factories close to make this shift from military to civilian goods. They have to close down for a while, so people are losing their jobs. At the same time, veterans are coming back from the war and they are looking for jobs. Farmers are going to have their own problems as Europe is now able to grow its own food. And so the price of food is going to drop, and farmers are going to see their incomes cut in half, even though they have the bulk of the debt that they still had after paying for mechanization in the last decade. A lot of businesses are moving south. There's less union activity in the South. And at the same time, cost of living is increasing in urban areas. And as we mentioned before, there's a lot of social turmoil as America is looking to itself instead of Europe for this kind of leadership. And this is the stage that President Harding is going to be coming into. Harding, excuse me, President Harding's catchphrase, to bring us back to normalcy, was probably the hallmark of this campaign, and voters liked it. We had a lot had gone on between the economic turmoil, World War I, the influenza outbreak that killed some 675,000 Americans. Many were looking to return to normalcy, and Harding would quickly and handily defeat the Democrat James Cox and his vice presidential Franklin Roosevelt. But very quickly, Harding is going to come into some problems that we're going to look at as something called the Red Scare. Now, of course, the Red Scare is actually going to begin in Russia, and it's going to begin long before the Harding presidency. So again, if you can recall in our discussions on World War I, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. So Tsar Nicholas II, if you do recall, lost power in March of 1917 and was replaced by a Republican government. Largely, the war was very rough on Russia, devastating casualties, food shortages, there were riots in the streets, and so the Tsar was forced to abdicate, was forced to step down. Now, the new Republican government made a very poor decision and pledged to remain in the war. And so what we're going to see then is another revolution in 1918 with a guy being led by a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin is going to promise peace, land, and bread. And he was quite a bit more radical than the Republican leaders that replaced the Tsar. But he is going to be successful. In November of 1917, they were able to overthrow this Republican government. Lenin's political party, they're going to call themselves the Bolsheviks, which is Russian for majority, even though they were a minority party. Great branding there. They're just going to call themselves the majority. And so once Lenin gets in, he gets out of the war. He cedes huge amount of land to Germany, and Russia is out of it. And Lenin is going to be spending the next couple of years really sort of solidifying his power. And by 1920, he is completely in charge of Russia, and a new nation is formed, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, also commonly called in the West the Soviet Union. So this new form of government is going to be communist, and it's going to be seen by the West as quite villainous. Let's take a look at this. So at the same time, where Harding, as you were, the same time, so Harding, like I mentioned before, was calling this return to normalcy. The spread of communism in Russia certainly flew in the face of that. So communism is almost the opposite of capitalism. Matter of fact, it's really kind of openly hostile. So under communism, there is no private ownership of land or business. The government controls all land and property. There is a single political party, and that's controlled by the government. And the rights of the community, if you can think of communism, it's the community. The rights of the community are much more important than the rights of the individual. So communism also challenged a lot of First Amendment sort of freedoms. Communism was atheistic. There is no God in communism. So Lenin really believed that this was a workers' revolt. This is a working class movement. If you're going to abolish the property, you don't have any wealthy people and poor people anymore. Everybody shares everything. So they really felt that this movement would quickly spread around the world. And what we're going to see is in America begins to look at this as challenging to its own moral values. And at the same time, we've become quite concerned with an awful lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe that are either communists or other radicals, such as anarchists, and they are in our midst. And there's a fear that we may have a communist revolution within the United States, as much as certainly Lenin and others believed it. So there's going to be a number of events, and we'll try to do these kind of one at a time. Let's start off with labor strikes. So the summer of 1919 is going to be a period of economic turmoil, as I mentioned before. Factories switching over, soldiers coming back. But if you do recall, I discussed in a previous lecture, the summer of 1919 was also called Red Summer for the racial riots. Very often we're going to see racial issues in the United States exacerbated because of economic instability and economic problems. And so those two things certainly go hand in hand. The summer of 1919 is going to see a massive increase in the number of strikes. During the war, very few unions or very few workers were really willing to strike. Soldiers are fighting overseas, fighting for freedom and democracy, and I'm not going to work because I want, a little more money or something like that. It wasn't politically smart. However, the war is over now, so strikes are going to begin. Beginning in March of 1919, there was around 175 strikes in that month, and by the summer, there'd be about 370 strikes in the August of 1919. At the same time, food prices are going up, clothing prices are going up, housing is going up, and the cost of living is increasing. And so there's a lot of, like I said, this economic turmoil. And the strikes are going to be widespread. The Boston Police Department will go on strike. They hadn't taken a raise since before the war. They advocated, they said they wanted a raise. They were rebuffed. The police commissioner fired 19 officers, union leaders within the police force. So the police force went on strike, and riots broke out in Boston within hours when the police walked off the job. The Massachusetts governor, Calvin Coolidge, who would become Harding's vice president a little later, called out the National Guard and urged calm. And he also stated unequivocally that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, and any time. So, really taking a tough stand against the Boston police. But besides, just you think about public servants by police, the major industries, steel workers across the country, U.S. Steel, the largest corporation in America, employing the most workers, went on strike. Some 350,000 workers walked off the job. Steel mills across the country were going down. Coal miners across the country were striking. We also see a number of general strikes, which is unions that aren't necessarily associated, let's say, for example, with U.S. Steel. They may be a union of dock workers or something, but they are going to go on strike as well to show solidarity, to force bosses to make these kinds of economic decisions that might be beneficial for the workers. So, with all these strikes going on, many people now are thinking that, is this the beginning of a workers' revolt? Are these actually communists? And are they stirring up sort of this trouble in America? So the federal government began to investigate radical activity, looking for communists within unions, looking for radical activity within the unions. So we have this economic sort of trouble going on. At the same time, the courts are looking at troubling behavior as well. So some of these are going to stem back from the World War I period, but it takes a while to move through the courts, and they're going to be moving through at this point. So the first one, Schenck v. the U.S. in 1919, the Supreme Court decided, yes, the government had the right or the duty to jail political radicals. So during World War One, Schenck basically mailed letters to young men who were drafted, urging them not to report for duty. And he was convicted under the Espionage Act. Again, another wartime law we discussed previously. And of course, Schenck just claimed he was exercising his rights to speak freely. He had a political opinion. The court's opinion, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, basically said that the government does have the right to silence free speech when there is, quote, a clear and present danger to the nation. And Holmes gives the famous anecdote with which many people, and you may have heard already, about that you don't have the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. You do that, people are scared, they run for the doors, some people are trampled, and that's not a free speech right. You don't have the right to do that. So again, here we're going to see wartime restrictions and fear leading to the curtailment of civil liberties such as free speech. Next one we're going to look at is Gitlow v. New York. So again, this is another one talking about radical speech. So the state of New York now, this is the state, had convicted Bernard Gitlow of criminal anarchy because he published in 1919 calls to overthrow the government by force. And basically this said, look, you can't call for the violent overthrow of a government. And the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, basically along kind of similar lines, saying that you can't urge people for violent revolution. Another case we're going to look at here, this one doesn't make it up to the Supreme Court, but certainly deals with our Red Scare. This is Sacco and Vanzetti, where two Italian immigrants became really sort of famous here in 1920 when they were arrested in Massachusetts. A shoe factory was robbed and a security guard was killed. A couple of weeks later, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested. One of them and I'm not exactly sure which one, but one of them had a pistol, and the pistol was the same model used as the gun in the crime, and so therefore on that evidence they were convicted. You see, it's a far cry from modern sort of forensic skills that could able maybe go to tell you, is this bullet fired by any one particular gun? In this case, it was just the same model of gun, and they were convicted. Even at the time, most, or sorry, not most, but many people felt that this trial was unfair, that they were being convicted purely because they were immigrants and they had radical political beliefs. But the jury found them guilty, sentenced them to death, and in April 1927, despite massive protests, they were executed by the electric chair. At the same time, all of this is happening. There are a number of bombings happening throughout the United States. Um, Mitchell Palmer is going to be the Attorney General of the United States, so the top kind of law enforcement officer at the time is going to be investigating this. Now, these bombings were pretty significant. So the mayor of Seattle had was his house was bombed. I don't believe anybody was injured in that one. A senator from Georgia received a bomb in the mail, and while the senator wasn't home, his housekeeper was injured. Attorney General Palmer himself was bombed as someone came to drop a bomb off at his front porch in his Washington, D.C. home. The bomb went off early. The perpetrator who was delivering the bomb was the only one killed. But it blew off the whole front of the house. Palmer's neighbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, actually ran across the street to search the rubble and ended up pulling out Palmer's housekeeper and possibly saving her life. So these number of bombings that were happening throughout the country, again, were quite fearful of many people and causing people to be quite scared. So we're going to see something called the Palmer raids, where Attorney General Palmer is going to be investigating what he saw as people that were subversive. And he's going to, through a bunch of special raids, trying to find people that are doing the bombing or at least calling for the overthrow of the government. And in 1920, about 33 cities, federal agents went around and arrested suspected radicals without much evidence and just charged them with anarchy. Many of them had been born overseas, and so it was very easy to deport someone, especially if they're not a citizen, even a naturalized citizen. So Palmer is going to be taking these particular actions. Again, we're going to see, because the fear of communism, and the fear was quite real. Right? We're going to shift now slightly and take a look at sort of other aspects of the Republican leadership at the time. And so we're going to look at, first of all, President Harding. And I've already talked about his idea here that, we're going to kind of get back to normalcy. But after a couple of years of Democratic rule, many Americans just really felt the Republican Party was more likely to lead to political stability than the Democratic Party. And so Republicans are going to dominate all three branches of government really for the next decade. And it's going to make them quite easy to fulfill these policies, including the new Chief Justice to the United States, former President William Howard Taft, will be appointed by Harding in 1921. He's the only former president to also serve as Chief Justice of the United States. Interesting idea here. So let's take a look at, first of all, Harding, and let's take a look at some of his ideas. So Harding, for a foreign policy idea, we're really thinking isolationism. So if you recall, remember, under isolationism, it doesn't, you just want to kind of avoid sort of entangling alliances that threaten America's independence. You can work with other nations, but we really don't want to be drawn into some of these issues. So we can have political alliances, maybe some economic alliances, but we don't want to become entangled, right? um, Not certainly interventionist. Certainly, like we had really happened, we had really done under Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft. We talked a lot about America getting involved in other parts of the world, and that's really not what the Republican presidents of the 20s are going to want to do. But that doesn't mean they're not getting involved. Harding proposed an international program of disarmament. He called for a Washington conference in 1922, and at the conference, several major military powers signed a treaty to limit the size of their military, especially their navies. Now, again, remember this is in the post-World War One world, and a lot of people felt that this was something that we needed to do to not have another world war. So Harding is going to do as much as he can to protect American trade. He's going to institute a very significant tariff, the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which is going to raise taxes on imported goods to historically high levels. Again, he wants Americans to buy American products. There's a couple of other issues we want to take a look at besides the economic. We're going to have a significant rise in nativism in the United States. And so if you recall, nativism is just this, it's a movement that favors native-born Americans over immigrants. So if you're born here, you're part of the club. If you're not, then you're really not a real American. And again, this was fostered by a number of different things. Certainly the Red Scare and this fear of secret communists and anarchists everywhere, but also, and again, this huge increase in immigration between 1890 and the early 20th century led many people to really challenge whether or not the country was headed in the right direction racially. And they had several reasons for this. They would argue, many Americans believe that foreigners could never fully be loyal to the United States. If I'm from, Poland, or I'm from, Russia, then I'm always going to sort of harbor some loyalty to them. Nativists, who were mostly Protestants, had long mistrusted immigrants that were mostly Catholic or Orthodox Christian or Jews. Nativists often blamed the problems in the cities, such as the slums or corruption, on the immigrants who lived in them. And just the other one is they feared that the workers, the immigrants are going to take jobs away from the workers, right? And as I said, sort of the Red Scare had maybe pushed things over the edge with many immigrants holding sort of radical political ideas, and they may spread these ideas to the United States. So, under the Harding administration, we're going to see two pieces of legislation, one in 1921 and 1924. And what they're going to do is restrict immigration. Without getting too deep into the weeds here, they're going to significantly decrease the number of people coming into the country from specific countries. Countries like Italy, Poland, Russia, Southern and Eastern Europe, parts of Asia. The numbers coming in from this part of the world are just going to dramatically increase. Again, Northwestern Europe, those numbers for those that want to come in will be are certainly acceptable. So while Harding is dealing with nativism through immigration reform, he's also going to have just a number of scandals and corruption that are going to be dealing with his presidency. Although he did enjoy strong popularity, he did have a number of scandals that came to light. Again, there was probably no real evidence that he himself was involved, but certainly the people that he had put in place had probably led to some of these particular scandals. Of these, probably the most famous is the Teapot Dome scandal, where Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly gave oil drilling rights on government lands in California. and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to a couple of private oil companies, and in return, they had given him more than $300,000 in bribes. So this was quite troublesome for the Harding administration. He often said, like, he doesn't have to worry about his enemies; he just has to worry about his friends, and all the troubles they tended to cause him. And during this time, possibly for a couple of different reasons, but Harding had certainly had some heart problems before that. But in August of 1923, Harding will die right in kind of the midst of these scandals. So it was kind of wondering sort of what had happened, if the scandals had put kind of undue stress on Harding. So Harding's vice president is going to be by the name of Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was actually visiting his parents in Vermont in 1923 when Harding had died, and when he got the news, it was 2:30 in the morning, and Coolidge's father, who was a justice of the peace, administered the oath of office and swore him in as president of the United States. Not the only president to be sworn in by his own father. So Calvin Coolidge is he's going to follow kind of the Republican mold of the 20s. Um, Coolidge was also called like Cool Cal, Silent Cal. He was certainly a friend to big business. His major theme, the chief business of the American people is business, is kind of summing up the decade. He was a person of very few words. He was also called like Silent Cal. One of his campaign slogans was "Keep cool with Cal." He was a skilled public speaker, but in these private settings, he was very quiet. Someone once said he could remain silent in 5 languages. At a dinner party one time, a woman sat next to him and said, "President Coolidge, I bet my friends that I can get you to say more than 2 words tonight." He looked at her and said, "You lose." That was it. That's all he said to her the entire night. So let's take a look more at Coolidge and some of his policies here. First of all, Coolidge, the public did not tie the scandals of the Harding presidency to Coolidge's, so he really did start off with a blank slate here. And so Coolidge, similar to Harding, is going to continue on with this idea of laissez-faire economics. So if you recall, laissez-faire economics basically just means government needs to stay out of the way of economic policies as much as possible. There shouldn't be a number of regulations and a number of rules set upon businesses. Let businesses do their thing. And under this point, Congress is going to lower the income tax, lower the inheritance tax, approves higher tariffs. That all these things benefit businesses and domestic manufacturing. Coolidge does decide that, similar to Harding, he doesn't want to get involved in foreign affairs, but that doesn't mean, that we're completely, walled off from the rest of the world. Under Coolidge's leadership, Secretary of State Frank Kellogg is going to work with the French ministers, and they're going to sign something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which 15 nations of the world threaten not to use war in their dealings with each other. So again, this is in 1927. Certainly, the memory of World War I is fresh on their minds. Eventually, 60 nations will join the pact. And the idea of just outlawing war. Again, you can almost see it as progressive in the sense that this is such a great idea, we can solve these problems. But of course, in reality, the pact is unrealistic. It's really unworkable. There's no provisions to enforce it. What if someone decides to do war? And certainly, within just a few years, I mean, by 1941, pretty much every nation that had signed the pact was at war. But certainly, you cannot fault them for giving it a good shot anyway. Okay, so that sums up today's lecture. Today we looked at what were the events that fueled the Red Scare of the early 1920s, what conflicts led to major labor strikes in 1919, and how did Republican leadership during the Harding and Coolidge presidencies shape the 1920s.